Hi, I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in San Diego. Thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to support the work that we do here, please consider making a contribution. Go to our website. It's easy to do. Thank you in advance for that contribution.
Today, Reverend Wendy completes her series, Our Spiritual Journey, with a talk titled Understanding Ego. This week, Reverend Wendy talks about working with the ego as a way of developing our consciousness. Reverend Wendy shows that there are ways to observe, awaken, purify, and evolve our egos as we continue to deepen our spiritual understanding.
So today we are actually winding up a somewhat short series that I have called Our Spiritual Journey. And together we have looked at a variety of very general topics that fall under the banner of our spiritual journey. We have looked at the idea of awakening. What is it? What does it feel like? What prompts it? And how do we move through it? We looked at the practice and the principle of intention, which is very much key to our unity and our science of mind teachings. We took an exploration of the topic of mindfulness and how very much that topic is popping up all around society now, not just in spiritual communities, but absolutely in all different sectors of society, and how beneficial that is. I mean, if we all practice mindfulness, it would be a much better world, don't you agree? Absolutely. Last week, we took a look at the fact that we all have a spiritual GPS. And it's always transmitting to us. We're not always paying attention to it, but it's always transmitting to us, and it will help us more easily get from point A to point B more easily, and hopefully with a little bit more fun along the way. But I would be remiss if I didn't include this one other topic on our spiritual journey, and it is the topic of our ego. Our ego. Perhaps you've heard the acronym that's pretty popular for ego, edging God out. Edging God out. That's certainly one way of looking at the ego. You know, we can't go very far in our spiritual journey before we start realizing, oh, wait a minute, I got some ego stuff going on here, and I've got to try to understand what it is and how to work with it. And so this morning I want to try to shed some light on the ego. I want to share 4 ideas with you on what the ego is, and then I also want to share 4 ways to work with the ego. So first of all, some people say that the ego is bad, that it's bad. Some people call the ego the enemy. Some people say that the job on the spiritual journey is to absolutely get rid of it. And then some on the spiritual journey say, we don't even have one. Well, I don't actually agree with any of those things. I don't really agree with any of those things. I don't believe that the ego is bad. I believe that the essence of the ego is divine, although its essence can be clouded over by a whole lot of stuff, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. The truth of the matter is, without an ego, we wouldn't exist. Without an ego, we wouldn't exist. So what is the ego? Well, I'll share with you what I think the ego is. I believe that the ego is simply my sense of me. Your ego is simply your sense of you. My ego is my sense of myself and the way that I present that out in the world, and the decisions that I make or the actions that I take based on my sense of what I think I am or who I think I am. Without a sense of myself, I really couldn't evolve spiritually. It really is the ego in me that I am trying to evolve. I am trying to evolve, awaken my sense of self. Does this make sense? Alrighty. So 4 important things to know about the ego. Number 1, we all have one. We all have an ego. We all have a sense of ourselves. Mahatma Gandhi had an ego. Martin Luther King Jr. had an ego. Mother Teresa had an ego. Jesus Christ had an ego. We all have an ego. The challenge is, for many of us, the ego is asleep to its larger self, its divine self, its God self. And that's where the problem comes in. So we all have an ego, but for many, our egos have been shaped primarily by these things, by how we look physically, by what we own, by what we have, by what we do, by what we know, by what other people think of us. Some of you are nodding your head to that one. By our feeling either of superiority over others or inferiority to others, or shaped by a feeling of separation, that I am just me and you are just you and we are completely separate. Now what we know spiritually is, what we know is physically we look separate, right? But what we know spiritually is at the very core, at the very essence, just as Shana so beautifully sang, we are one. What we know at our very core, at our very essence, at our very core, our very essence, not only are we one, but we are made of the same divine sparkle, the same divine dust that has no color, that has no ethnicity, that has no sexual orientation or preference. This is why it is absolutely ridiculous for anyone who is growing and evolving spiritually to ever get hung up on the external of what anybody looks like, whether it's race, ethnicity, social or sexual orientation or gender identification. Because at the essential level, at the soul level, we are one, and we are made of the same divine spark, the same divine energy. But that is not the way the ego usually starts out knowing. You see, the ego, while we all have one, is been predominantly and culturally shaped by a lot of input around us that's not necessarily true, and in many cases is actually harmful. The second thing that we need to understand about this thing that we all have, this sense of self that we all have, is how the unawakened ego presents itself. How the unawakened ego presents itself. Say that with me. How the unawakened ego presents itself. So here are some of the ways that the unawakened ego presents itself. It tends to be very judgy. Say that with me. Very judgy. Say it like that. Very judgy, right? There's a difference between being spiritually discerning. We need to be spiritually discerning. This is what I think Jesus was speaking about when he said, to not judge, but to judge righteously. It is to be spiritually discerning. What he was telling us not to do is to be judgy. Right? And you're not going to forget that part, right? Okay. Because we all have that. We all have a bit of that and maybe a lot of that within us. And that is the ego. And that judginess usually comes because we are feeling threatened, or we are feeling afraid, right? Or we are comparing ourselves to somebody else. We're comparing our insides to their outsides, or vice versa. And so the unawakened ego is a rather ugly aspect of our human nature. You see, our spiritual journey is about softening the edges of our human nature, so to speak, and dissolving this sense, so to speak, of the boundaries of the ego, awakening it, so that the ego begins to reflect much more fully the divine core of us, the divine energy of us. Unawakened, the ego tends not only to be judgy and fearful and jockeying for position, very much like the disciples jockeying for position. Who was going to sit closest to Jesus? There was a reason for that. Social status was often determined by who you sat close to, blah, blah, blah. But they were very much into the ego positioning, the jockeying for position. The unawakened ego tends to really crave recognition and acknowledgement and approval, and will do anything and everything it can to get that if it doesn't feel like it's getting enough of it. And so we're going to talk in a few minutes about how do you work with some of this, how do you recognize some of this. So a third thing we need to understand about the ego, and this is a really important part of it, is that it can be transformed. It can be awakened. It's not that we're trying to get rid of it. We're trying to clean it up. We're trying to open it up. We're trying to awaken it. What happens when we try to have you ever tried to get rid of something by pushing it away? Raise your hand if you've ever tried to get rid of something by pushing it away. How did that work for you? Not well. What happened to it when you try to push it away? Yeah, it comes back stronger. I want you to hold this visual. I want you to hold a visual of a beach ball. You know, the kind that were popular. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember, as I am, if you're like in the 1960s. Beach ball, white, the stripes, you know, the red and the yellow and the green, right? Come on, nod your head. You know what I'm talking about. And pushing that beach ball down in the ocean water or in the swimming pool, pushing it, pushing it, pushing it. Hey, are you with me? Are you pushing the beach ball down? All right, you're pushing the beach ball down, right? Keep it down for the rest of the service. Now, I'm feeling really nasty. Keep it down all week long. What's going to eventually happen? But why is it going to pop up? You're going to get tired of holding it down. What else might happen? Maybe you don't get tired. Maybe what? Huh? You slip? You slip? Say again? You forget, right? Or something else crosses your mind, or you have to take care of something else. And what happens to that beach ball? It just comes going up so slowly. Right? No, what happens? If more you have pushed it down, it pops up and probably slaps you in the face on the way up, right? So it's not that we're trying to get rid of this ego. In fact, there are teachers like Eckhart Tolle who say the very act of trying to get rid of it is the ego playing its game with you anyway. So it's the recognition that it's not about getting rid of it. It's an aspect of who we are as human beings. It's my sense of myself. It's your sense of yourself. There are some aspects of your sense of yourself that are working really well for you. And there are some that are probably getting in your way. But that can be transformed, and that's part of what our journey is. And then the fourth is that the ego, and this comes from Eckhart Tolle, the ego isn't wrong, it's just unconscious. It's just unconscious. This is something he wrote in, I don't know if it was Awaken, I forget which book it was, but something he wrote about the ego. The ego isn't wrong, it's just unconscious. When you observe the ego in yourself, you're beginning to go beyond it. Don't take the ego too seriously. When you detect ego behavior in yourself, smile. At times you may even laugh. How could humanity have been taken in by this for so long? Above all, know that the ego isn't personal. It isn't who you are. If you consider the ego to be your personal problem, that's just more ego. That's just more ego. So how do we work with it? How do we work with it? I think there are some simple things that we can put into practice. And if we do some of these simple things on a regular basis, we're going to find that we're able to awaken the ego. And the more that the ego, our sense of self, is awakened, what it's really awakening to is the larger dimension of the divine in us. So when the ego awakens, it is awakening to the larger whole dimension of the divine in us. So first is by observing. Observe the ego by paying attention to when it's acting out and ugly. What were some of the things I said to you earlier are some of the signs that the ego is acting out or that we are suffering from an unawakened ego. Do you remember some of them? Okay, some of you said it, well, judgy. So when we catch ourselves, you know when you're being judgy, right? Nod your head. We know when we're being judgy, even if we don't articulate it, we can feel it inside. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't feel good. It's not uplifting. So observe it. Pay attention to some of the common signs, whether it's the words coming out of your mouth, or whether it's the thoughts going around in your head, pay attention. Am I being judgy here? Am I suddenly feeling superior? I'm just feeling better than anybody else in this room. Or I'm feeling less than anybody else in this room. I'll tell you, one of the things that was personally really helpful to me was quite some time ago in learning more about the ego. I forget which teacher first brought to my awareness that the ego can act out either in feelings of superiority or feelings of inferiority. And what I found in myself is more often I was feeling the feelings of inferiority, not the feelings of superiority. And that when we are feeling either of those feelings, we are not being true to the divine that is within us. When we are feeling superior, we are tending to push other people down and away so we feel better about ourselves, and it's most often based on criticisms and judgments. But what can happen when we are feeling inferior is that we are telling ourselves a story that's holding us back from being who and what Spirit or God would have us do and be to make a difference in the world. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So even looking at either end of those, observing, oh, am I feeling better than everybody else right now? Or am I somehow feeling worse than everybody else right now? The truth of the matter is we are one. And we each have different gifts and different strengths to give out into our families and into our worlds. And when we do that, when we play true to what's highest and best in us, not only do we benefit, but everybody around us begins to benefit from that. Aren't you glad that there are people who do things really well that you can't do? Yeah, and aren't you glad that there are things you do really well? If you're honest with yourself and you stop and think about it, there are things that you do really well or ways of being that are very beautiful about you, and that's your gift to give. So observe it when it's acting out. Being judgy, being controlling, feelings of superiority or feelings of inferiority, when you're seeking approval, when you feel slighted because you didn't get a big enough thank you or a big enough acknowledgement, stop and ask yourself, what is that really about? What is that really about? The second is to awaken it by being aware of the present moment. Eckhart Tolle says, the decision to make the present moment into your friend is the end of the ego. Think about that for a moment. Think about that. Awaken it, awaken your ego by being more aware of the present moment, being right wherever you are, be there fully, and not just in body. Have you ever just been with somebody whose body is there, but they're nowhere with you? Do you know what I'm talking about here, right? You think you're in a relationship with this person or a conversation with this person because physically they're present and they're not interrupting you? But you know that they're not there. Nod your head if you know what I'm talking about, right? So that's not what I'm talking about. It's not just the body being in the present moment. It's our fullness being in the present moment, our full awareness, our mindfulness. And what Tolle is saying is that when we are more fully present, when we embrace this moment, the ego, I believe what he's suggesting, is the ego begins to quiet down and open up or awaken. The third is to purify it by practicing non-reaction to the ego in others. Let me repeat that because I think that's a real important practice and a real gem. We can purify our own ego or heal our ego by practicing non-reaction to the ego of others. Now this is going to sound, put on your discerning hat right now, okay? Not your judgy hat. So your discerning hat. Are there people in your life that your discerning hat would truly say tend to act out very much from an unawakened ego? Yes? Watch if you have too much energy around saying, yes, yes, that could be the judgy part of you, right? But we can practice learning how to be more objective and more discerning. And yes, there are people in our lives that are probably acting much more out of a state of unawakened ego and behaving in many of the ways that I've just described, just like we do at times as well, all right? up until this point, what I've shared with you is observing ourselves, right? But we can also do some work to purify ourselves or heal our own ego, learning to awaken it more by practicing not having a reaction to the ego in other people. And so that's going to require a certain amount of mindfulness, right? A certain amount of holding a sacred space, a quiet space. And by quiet, I don't mean that we don't speak what we might need to speak. I'm talking about an energy of calmness, an energy of serenity. When we do that, what begins to happen is we can help to deflate or take away some of the power of the unawakened collective ego. Would you not say that looking around the way some of us are operating in our world today, especially in our own country today, that maybe there's quite a bit of unawakened ego operating? Okay, I feel that too. And I'm also aware how easy and tempting it is for me to get very judgy about that, and how that does not help the situation. But learning to find ways to be in those reactive places without the ego reacting, but operating from a place of awareness, operating from a place of spiritual integrity and intention, helps to dissolve the collective human ego. And then the last that I would suggest is not resisting the ego. So when you notice that in yourself, don't resist it. The minute you feel like you're resisting it, you're blaming yourself, you're punishing yourself, you're doing all this awful self-talk. Don't resist it. Play with it. What do I mean by that? I'll share something with you personal. I'm not going to share all of the personal part of it with you, but I'll share some of it with you. At my core, I'm a rather playful person. And at my core, when things are difficult for me spiritually, I try to make them more playful inside. That doesn't mean I don't take them seriously. I do take them seriously. But if I can make it a little more playful, it's a little more palatable to me, and I'll stay the course of practicing it a little bit longer. So I have a name for my ego. I'm not going to tell you the name, and it's not a nasty name, but I have a name for my ego. And when that part of Wendy is acting out, I will quietly and silently and playfully talk to her. And I might even say things to her like, "Thank you very much for sharing." However, and I've given her a voice, and I'm not going to try to mimic or tell you what the voice is, but it's funny. But by doing that, I'm much less likely to resist it in the way I used to go about trying to change myself, which was almost like white-knuckling it and willing my way through any personal growth or spiritual change I wanted to make. And, maybe in my 20s and 30s, I had enough energy to do that for those decades, but not now. And I don't think it's the most gentle way, and I'm not even sure it's the most effective way to grow spiritually. So my suggestion is, don't resist it. Play with it, notice it, don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Don't justify it, but don't add to it by resisting it. What do we say in metaphysics? What we resist persists. It's just like the beach ball. When I push it down, it means I haven't dealt with it. I'm just trying to get rid of it by resisting it. As soon as something happens, I get tired or I have to do something else, it's going to come right back up. So play with it. Play with it. Give it a name. Give it a funny voice, okay? And then I want to close with some words that I found very helpful. I just found these this weekend as I was doing a little more thinking about today's message. I'm not very familiar with this teacher, but I liked what this teacher had to say. Some of his background is studying in various ashrams in India and in Zen Buddhism. His name is Anadi. The purpose of awakening is not to annihilate our human identity or to dissolve our ego, but to integrate our human consciousness with our higher being so that we can experience our me from the depth of our soul We must question and transform our relationship with who we truly are, including the very one who, no matter how much we despise it, will remain our lifetime companion, our ego. Ego needs to be embraced as a positive aspect of our identity, without which we cannot actualize the very purpose of our creation. Ego does indeed need to become more conscious. It needs to be purified, healed, and transformed through surrender to our soul. And yet we should never forget that its essence is divine. Awakening a constructive, intelligent, and affectionate perception of our ego is the first step on the path and the first real step into self-love. I want to repeat that line. Awakening a constructive, intelligent, and affectionate perception of our ego is the first step on the path and the first real step into self-love. If this step is not taken, there are no other steps to take. Namaste.
Many people enjoy Reverend Wendy's talks and meditations and aren't able to attend the Unity Center in person. If you're part of our extended family from around the world and would like to help support the Unity Center, please go to our website or download our free app, which offers even more ways to connect with the Unity Center. Namaste.